Well, hello and good afternoon, everybody. I suppose it's afternoon now. Thank you for joining us. My name is Eric Clay. I am the marketing lead and also the co-lead of threat intelligence research at Flare. Nick, do you want to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you for having me. Good morning and good afternoon, depending where you're dialing in from. I'm Nick. I lead our corporate security efforts at Snap or Snapchat.
Awesome. And Nick, we're going to start. I'm going to actually start. I never do this, but we're going to actually start on the main slide here. And I'd like your help in defining what is the dark web versus the gray web, because the gray web, I think, is a really, really interesting term. I think most people are familiar with the dark web, but how do you define this kind of difference between these two?
Yeah. So the way I look at it, and this may not be the textbook definition, this is my, let's call it, colloquial definition. The dark web is the part of the internet that's not accessible via normal internet browsers and normal means. It's the part that's only accessible via Tor or other anonymized browsing mechanisms that require you to use the Onion network, or Tor as it's called. And those parts of the internet are not really within reach even most humans. A lot of people don't even understand this is an existent thing, and even people in the industry don't really fully understand it unless they work in threat intelligence. Then the gray web is basically the parts of the internet that are normally accessible, things like Telegram channels and other forums that happen to be questionable in nature, and activities on those forums are not well regulated, either by virtue of them being in lowly or loosely regulated countries that are hard to regulate from a government perspective, like Cyprus and some others, or they are purely being ran as wild west kind of platforms that don't comply with government inquiries, EDR disclosures, emergency data requests. And what ends up happening is folks like Pavel Durov end up getting arrested in France because they do not follow the rules as Telegram for government interventions and information disclosures. And for that reason, it's great. And I think that's a really good example of exactly why Pavel was held at the Paris airport, is because Telegram has not been following the rules for a long time, and I don't think they want to, and so hence they squarely fall into this category.
Yeah, I think those are both excellent examples, Nick. And I think people underestimate a lot of how closely, I think people think a lot of the dark web, there's a cybercrime ecosystem. It's often its kind of own space. And yeah, there's definitely super hard to access dark web forums that require private invitations from people and custom links that you wouldn't know how to get to otherwise. Then you have to have an account, etc. I think a lot of people underestimate the blending of these two ecosystems, where there's these components on social media sites like Telegram, or I guess you could consider Telegram a social media application, but in any case, or even some of our research team at did previous work in a university setting, looking at how the cybercrime ecosystem actually uses freelancer sites to employ people for web design for phishing sites, etc. And so there's this blending over that's not always clear to people. And you were the one who came up with the gray web piece of the title, but I thought it was really clever because it is a great example, right? You're blending the black and white. So
absolutely, and that's why I'm wearing a gray sweater today.
See, I'm wearing a blue, so I'm totally out of fashion here. But we're going to start the conversation talking about Stealer logs, and we're probably going to end the conversation talking about Stealer logs as well. So fair warning to all of our audience. But this is, I think, a great example of the gray web and how there's not just these cybercrime forums that you need to be worried about, but how the cybercrime ecosystem is expanding and spreading, and it's pretty complicated, and there's a lot of risk associated with it. So we're going to be covering what's at stake, why you should care, what an info stealer log even is, what other types of malware exist, what a company should be aware of, and how this is impacting the risk landscape. So I'm going to start with you, Nick. What's at stake? We'll just start there and then we'll move on.
Yes. So the gateway to most information systems is a authentication credential of some sort, right? And as security leaders, we are constantly worried about what happens if a credential is exposed to individuals that should not have access to it, whether that's malicious individuals or whether that's even malicious insiders. And often those credentials for corporate systems and enterprise authentication, they tend to be long-lived. Very few companies have short duration credentials because out of convenience, or they just haven't gotten their company there. And a lot of companies also don't have strong MFA. They don't have phishing resistant MFA. They're still maybe using SMS-based MFA. They're still maybe using TOTP-based MFA, which, as we've seen through attacks in 2022 with various hacking groups, those are susceptible to MFA fatigue. Very few companies are using phishing-resistant MFA. So that being the case, what's at stake is authentication material to your company's information assets. And that's exactly what's happening is these authentication materials are being stolen, and we'll talk about how in a minute. And then they're being clearly sold and even like auctioned in batches to the highest bidder. And then those individuals go take them and then use them very quickly. So really hard problem, honestly, as a security leader to solve. But let's continue. Let's discuss perhaps why we should care.
Yeah. So this slide talks a lot about the state of cybersecurity with Stealer logs as a new vector of attack. And there's this great quote from the IBM X-Force report. In this era, the focus has shifted to logging in rather than hacking in. And you see on the right a list of companies that recently had challenges with info stealer malware. And it's really interesting. And so, Nick, I think it might be worth kind of visiting kind of an old topic to help set the scene for this kind of new topic of info stealer malware, which is kind of what I call, and if you have a better name for it, because I do think you probably have better naming schemas for most of these things than me, but like traditional credentials. What is a traditional credential leak, and how is it kind of different than this new, much more high risk threat? Because I think I think people have a tendency just to say credentials, and then everybody imagines like password reuse, and that's kind of that.
Yes. So traditionally, there's been a couple ways this happens. There were credentials exposed through commits to public repositories. This has been happening for 10 to 12 years, probably. There's been credentials exposed just through social engineering and authentication portals. There's been credentials exposed through employees that left who remember those credentials that still are able to use those credentials. Those credentials are not rotated after the let's say employee who had access to like a super admin account leaves, right? That's the old way of thinking about this problem. The new way of thinking about this problem is very different. So what has changed is there's super targeted specific malware to literally go after authentication credentials that is written and deployed by professional crime forums that exist literally to harvest these credentials, collect them into batches, package them like you're trying to sell something on the open market, and sell them quickly to the highest bidder. And sometimes these are even auction style scenarios. They call them dumps, right? And then somebody else buys them, and then that somebody else can use those credentials for multitude of attacks. What else has changed is that the folks behind things like the Octopus, they created phishing kits that allow you to create high quality lookalike phishing domains for authentication providers, IDPs, that are extremely believable, right? And with similar sounding domains, basically using human vulnerability of not looking closely enough. That's also changed. That's kind of another angle of this. That isn't exactly info stealer, but they can be coupled together. So the first part could be the lookalike phishing domain. The second part could be harvesting of the credentials via malware installed on the endpoint. And because of many companies have long-lived credentials because out of convenience and lack of strong phishing-resistant MFA, this is extremely effective. And like literally, once they have them, they can start using them as soon as they have them, unless there's some restrictions the company has in place on authentication to the enterprise systems, which we'll talk about throughout the call today.
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple interesting elements to touch on here. So, Nick, one of the things as you describe it, I think you did a really nice job, is this, it's not just like one element or one new type of malware that's the problem, which, you could say, well, info stealer malware is an absolutely huge problem, but it's this complex ecosystem around it that enables kind of easy cyber attacks, right? So you don't just have the info stealer malware, but you have vendors selling licenses to the info stealer malware. You have other threat actors buying them. Then you have the same threat actor can then go buy a phishing kit targeted at Okta or a different kind of authentication system. And so it becomes like maybe 10 years ago, you had to design your own phishing pages and design or use somebody else's malware that you found kind of open source. And now there's this whole complicated licensing scheme and ecosystem that has been built up around it that enables even pretty low sophistication actors to have access to resources that even a few years ago they never would have had before.
Yeah, that's spot on. Actually, I don't think it's complicated. I think it's complicated in terms of like there's many parts to it, but it's actually very streamlined. So, once upon a time, if I wanted to do something like this, I'd have to use Kali on a live CD. I've been doing this for 20 years. So I remember those days, right? And I'd have to find like, oh, what's the right like module and submodule in Kali to create a phishing domain for employee phishing awareness training, right? Now these are like SaaS applications, Eric. Like you show up, you put in a credit card or a Bitcoin wallet address, and you pay for them like you would pay for Jira, right? Or Coda or like any like legitimate SaaS thing, but they're illegitimate. But they're that sort of like accessible. So you don't really need a lot of technical sophistication. I mean, I would dare say you don't need to know how to write code to do any of this at this stage.
Yeah, I think that's completely accurate. I think there's another really interesting element here too. So I think Telegram figures very prominently in this story as well, and I'd like to dive into that a bit. And then I also want to talk about what we have on the right with the different company logos. And we're not trying to name and shame here. There's actually a really interesting thing that happened that's worth discussing. But for specifically talking about Telegram, because I think this is a great mix of the gray web, you see info stealers distribute both. You see people selling info stealer malware and selling stealer logs on dark web forums. But I think one of the kind of key components that has made all of this much more accessible is the move of a lot of this to Telegram. I did a talk last year at B-Sides Northern Virginia. I'm doing another one this year on a different topic, but one of the kind of jokes we made is it's really like we're going to teach you a really secret way to find like cybercrime Telegram rooms. Like first you open up Telegram, and then second you type in fraud. And there you go. That's it. Like you found probably like 100 like credit card fraud and other types of Telegram channels. But can you talk a little bit about Telegram's kind of role in the info stealer malware ecosystem and maybe how it's enabled actors who may not have been highly sophisticated actors on dark web forums?
Yeah, it's a great pivot. I think this is very timely with what's happening with Telegram founder and co-founder. So both of the brothers, Pavel and I believe it's Nikolai, have now been arrested recently at the CDG airport in Paris. And really, I believe the reason that's happening is Telegram was originally created in the Russian Federation, right? And I'm from Eastern Europe, so I have a lot of like sort of social understanding of how these things work. For whatever reasons, things arising out of the Russian Federation have always been in the gray in terms of like internet usage and like internet capabilities and such. Over time, the founders of Telegram, Pavel and his brother, built up an adversarial relationship with the Russian Federation government because they wanted to intervene in what they were doing. And so they moved their infrastructure and exiled themselves out of the Russian Federation to other countries. I believe he was residing in Dubai prior to this most recent arrest. And they moved their infrastructure to co-location facilities in places that are hard to reach from a policing perspective, right? I don't know exactly where they are, but I believe Cyprus is one of the locations they use. And so this created this sort of like protective net that Telegram can be the wild, wild west and become the gray web. Anything goes on Telegram, right? And they're protected from civil and government intervention. They sort of have immunity to operate because of how the companies are structured. And it's not really a company. It's more of sort of like a research project that became a company. And then they did a big raise through a crypto offering that funded their efforts to run infrastructure because it costs a lot to run it. But they don't operate like a company, as far as I know. Like they don't operate like with an HR team with like proper executives. They operate as a loosely coupled group of people that have a belief that Telegram needs to be the mechanism for communicating on the internet. And maybe that's fine, but then because they're so unregulated, because they're so loose, and because they're so avoidant of inquiry from governments, it's a perfect place, a perfect platform for bad actors to show up because they have a big reach. Because what does the bad actor want? Like a bad actor wants to take what they stole from your company's authentication materials and they want to batch them and they want to sell them. Well, in order to sell anything, you need a marketplace. Like so, once upon a time, marketplaces were physical, right? Obviously a digital marketplace. Well, to have a large reach, you need a marketplace that has a large amount of daily active users, right? And this is exactly what it is, right? and it's easily indexed, quickly found. So for them, it's like the best form of a digital eBay, if you will, right, for selling
Mhm.
InfoSeal logs, and they literally auction them. Like, I mean, I've seen these posts, like they start with like a bidding price, and then sometimes they're like even programmatically auctioned in
Yeah.
batches to the highest bidder. And that's why it's a bunch of different things that led to this. But I think that's why Telegram is very dangerous. And I think what the authorities are doing is the right like general direction for interfering with their operations.
One of the super interesting things, Nick, that we've seen is we've actually seen what we call live Telegram channel Stealer log channels get set up. And so what the threat actor is actually doing is they're using Telegram's API as the backend. So a Telegram channel is actually the backend of their malware. So the C2 infrastructure sends the log data directly from the victim or from the C2 infrastructure directly into a Telegram channel. And so they're literally like, as infections are happening within a few minutes, live Stealer logs of a snapshot of the victim's computer, essentially. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the type of data that logs collect, are just populating these channels. And so it's really, really interesting how they're able to kind of like programmatically automate in some way cybercrime, and then automate the selling of the channel access as well.
Well, that's exactly right. Like, and if they were a legitimate platform, like they wouldn't allow this to happen. They would look at the user agents that were connecting. They'd look at the IPs. They look at how their APIs were used. They would do rate limiting, but they're not legitimate. That's why they don't care, and that's why they basically this is allowed to happen.
Yeah, so I think the last point I want to touch on here is like this snowflake. A lot of people were talking about a snowflake breach a few weeks ago, and it could have changed in the meantime. But my understanding, and I'd love your thoughts on this. Last time I had read about it was Snowflake was not actually breached. What really happened is threat actors realized that there were a lot of Snowflake credentials to various customer environments in Stealer logs, and so this is say somebody from a Snowflake customer signing into their Snowflake environment, saving the credentials on their browser, and then that person downloads InfoStealer. All those credentials get leaked on the cybercrime ecosystem, and then threat actors leverage that to get into the Snowflake customer's account. And I think this is really interesting because I think it's difficult to report on these things because it's kind of complicated. But I was wondering what your thoughts were on and then there was kind of like this wildfire effect where other people were like, oh, hey, there's like these great Snowflake credentials and Stealer logs. We could just go log into Snowflake environments, and this is like easy and fast. And one thing about criminals is they will always pick the easiest and fastest way to do what they're trying to do.
Yeah, it's a little bit inconclusive, right? I think the final root cause report hasn't been issued yet, but I believe this is true. And I could see this happening to other providers. I could see this happening to AWS. I could see this happening to Google. There's really no restrictions on this happening. It's like again, like once you have the credentials are long lived, which in many cases they are. If you have AWS access keys, what's to prevent a bad actor from taking those AWS access keys and using them against you, right? Like there's really very little preventative mechanism unless you have special authentication controls in place to only allow authentication to your AWS access keys from specific enterprise managed environments that have like device trust restrictions, for example.
Yeah, no, that absolutely makes sense. And I think it's a really interesting example of how you just have more and more of these kind of like low sophistication actors coming in and then just finding easy ways to get access to data that they wouldn't necessarily have otherwise been able to. So we're going to move on to Stealer logs by the numbers. And I think this is a really good exit. Like, so we did an example, stay up Flare, full disclosure, we collect Stealer logs for our customers to help prevent data breaches. But we have right now 65 million total logs. We estimate about 5 to 10% of those logs have corporate credentials. So you're looking at somewhere between 3 and 8 million logs with corporate credentials. I guess 7 million. I have the number here, 7 million. And we think that these are responsible for a huge number of major breaches. We've even seen ransomware groups specifically trying to buy Stealer logs with corporate credentials. And then threat actors can also target customer accounts. I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add here. Nick, I do have one kind of follow-up question on the Telegram piece, though, for you after.
Yeah, I think there's broadly two cohorts here, as you put it. So there's a corporate credentials piece, which is very powerful, and those probably sell for more. There's also customer credentials, as alluded to, which are generally stolen a similar way, actually, because it's the same concept of they're being pulled from the browser using malware that observes these credentials from the keychain or whatever authentication material is made available in the local bash profiles of the user, for example, in the case of like AWS access keys. But I think the way you approach it is a lot different. So with corporate credentials, I think it's a lot more directly impactful to your company, because they literally can be used to authenticate to company services and literally create a breach for you, right? With customer credentials, there's a lot more nuance to how to actually respond to knowing about this information, right? So you can do step-up authentication, you can do mandatory password rotations, right? But generally, like, humans are going to be humans. They're going to be resistant to a change. And so you can't be as like heavy-handed with customer credentials as with corporate credentials. With corporate credentials, yeah, as the head of corporate security, I can say, okay, we absolutely need to go rotate these credentials. There's no question about that, and we're going to go do it. With customer credentials, there's this constant like balance of, well, what people are going to fall off in terms of a user base. What's the growth impact of this, right? And I actually used to work in this part of the team at Snap, years ago, and we constantly kind of like balance, like, what's the right level of friction in terms of customer authentication requirements to make sure people don't stop using the app.
Yeah, that's an interesting point I hadn't thought too much of before. It's really easy to say, well, you should just buy a credential monitoring thing and reset all of your customers' credentials. But people leak their credentials in both stealer logs and in more traditional ways very, very often. And so, if somebody's having to reset their passwords 3 times a year on your application, are people actually going to use it? Or are they going to go to a competitor that's not forcing them to do that, even though it's making them less safe? So that's a really interesting thought. Do you think, Nick, that companies are going to move more and more towards this model of kind of proactive security on behalf of customers? Or do you think it's going to kind of continue to be steady state as is?
I think they have to, right? I think this is just a matter of time as companies adopt both better authentication mechanisms like passkeys that are a lot harder to steal and reuse, also better techniques to identify abuse of credentials. So there's ways you can fingerprint a device, look at the device identifier, kind of like a nonce, if you will, off of the device, and then see, this person is logging in from a different device, has a different device identifier. Do I want to do a step-up authentication? Like, just purely based on that, right? And send them an OTP. Now, sometimes the bad actor will control that OTP channel as well, but not commonly the case. So I think the industry needs to evolve in 2 ways. One is, let's shift away from passwords. Like, passwords, let's face it, Eric,
are terrible.
This is an invention that's caused us so much pain for the last 30 years as cybersecurity professionals. We have an alternative now. It's just a matter of adoption. Like, passkeys are much more better. So I think that's one thing. The second thing is, let's get smarter and better as an industry for people running B2C type authentication services, right? To do risk detection and step-up authentication to reduce the likelihood of account takeover. That's really the only way that this is going to improve over time.
Yeah, I think those are both excellent examples. And I want to pivot to talking about, well, people have definitely heard of the malware now because we've been talking about it, but I want to pivot a little bit to discussing kind of the nitty-gritty of info stealer logs and maybe some of the more pernicious aspects that people aren't aware of. Because I think it's really easy to fixate on the credentials, right? You get all of the credentials for a single user that they've saved in their browser, but that's not all the info stealer steals, if I'm not mistaken, Nick. Do you want to talk about some of the specific other data elements that the stealer grabs that could be really risky for a corporate information security team?
Right. Yeah, exactly. So look, depending on the specific variant of malware, it could go after session credentials that are live, that are literally cookies in the browser. They can go after other form-filled data, as we talk about in the examples here. But it could also be more sophisticated and look at secrets that are part of bash profiles that people have set up with AWS accounts and GCP accounts and whatever, right? And unless you have a really good hygiene on refreshing those credentials periodically to not have long-lived credentials, but in most companies, those credentials are long-lived, unless you have just-in-time kind of mechanisms to refresh them and make them shorter-lived, which is very hard to do. And there's a bunch of different ways of doing it, but a lot of people don't do that. So, the consequence here could literally be all the authentication materials off of your device have now been lifted and given to that actor that live streams them into a Telegram channel, and there's literally an auction going on for those credentials. This is really how it happens, right? And it's super consequential, and the ability to catch this and detect it and to do something about it is quite difficult. So as a classic blue teamer, I've taken the stance of like, let's make this super hard to do. Like, let's make this super hard to do, and have, you know, best in breed anti-malware controls. Let's have device trust controls so they can't reuse them. Let's have shorter sessions where they're only valid for a very short amount of time. But even with all those efforts, you know, not all companies can make such big investments. I still think you need a way to monitor for the existence of these on the dark and gray web, so you can act on it. Yes, and some of the information is going to be false positives, and some of it you'll be chasing yourself. But regardless, unless you're monitoring for this, you're going to be living in a dark room.
Yeah, I think there's also like a VIP or even just a company employee protection aspect here too, because if you do have an info stealer that infects a corporate employee, the threat actor is probably going to get, assuming they use their browser like most people do, their social security number, their date of birth, all of the different email addresses they use, their home address, all of the saved credentials, all of the session cookies, a snapshot of their browser. The potential for kind of identity theft or impersonation or even very targeted phishing attacks also goes dramatically up once a threat actor basically has a snapshot of somebody's digital life. So if you can imagine like your CEO or CFO or somebody like this getting hit, it's very, very important, not only for the corporate security aspect, but also for their personal security.
You should probably prioritize VIP or high value targets, as we used to call it, whaling in the industry, right? You should probably prioritize that. And there's also another element to the info stealer that I don't think a lot of people are talking about. Chrome extensions and other extensions can be a form of info stealer. We haven't really seen this quite yet, but because Chrome extensions are very permissive and have access to low-level browser data, like browser tabs, low-level information about the machine, they themselves are a threat, right? And so you should have a strategy for how you approach the allowance of extensions in your browsing profiles.
Nick, do you think that there's anything that on the browser side that could be done, or is this really more of a employee and like corporate side of things, like the Google in the case of Chrome, Mozilla in the case of Firefox?
Absolutely, and we're big fans of something called device-bound session credentials, DBSC. So DBSC is an initiative that's being led by the Chrome security team, and Parisa is one of the leading figures of this, to basically bind session credentials to your machine's TPM chip, right? The trusted enclave in most modern computers to store cryptographically sound material, including decryption keys and such for your hard drive encryption. Is the TPM. And so this technique, once the industry adopts it over time, this is the very early stage of it. We're like literally year one. DBSC will, I think, largely solve this problem, because then if the credential is stolen, but the TPM that it's attempted to be used on a replayed on another machine, is going to cryptographically mismatch. It won't be usable, right? And it'll take companies a long time to get here. It'll take providers a long time to get here, but this is the kind of thing right now, like at the browser level, that is pivoting the industry to make this safer. This is more like 5 years out, I would say, like from mass adoption. But another thing that's happening is Google is working on high frequency cookie rotation, and it's something we have implemented, for example, where you rotate the cookie more frequently, hence the time of opportunity for the cookie to actually be valid is a lot tighter, because the refresh token refreshes the cookie, and it has to be like this exact version of it that's only valid for an hour, let's say, and then after that hour it's rotated again and it's invalid. So those are a couple browser security and machine level examples that I see as emerging in the industry that can help with this problem.
Yeah, no, I think those are all fantastic points, Nick. I did want to quickly go over the anatomy of a stealer log, because I do think it's important. So we have kind of three different views here. On the left-hand side, we have the autofills. So this is the kind of what a stealer log looks like if you download one. You get all of the autofills. So this is where people save their home address, their name, their social security number. You get the cookie, you get the session cookies, which is this far right screenshot over here. This is all fake data. GPT is actually really great if you want to give ChatGPT real data and be generate fake data for me. It's very helpful in giving you what looks exactly the same, but is all completely made up. You get domain detects. You get important autofills. I actually don't know the difference between autofills and important autofills. I don't know how it's playing that out. It tells you the installed browsers, installed software. The passwords.txt file pulls from all of the different browsers on the computer and pulls all the passwords into one place. A list of processes running on the computer, user information, and then one thing that's not included in this presentation, but it's also very consequential, is like screenshots. In a lot of cases, that the malware actually will take a screenshot of the victim's desktop, which often tells you how they got infected. And without giving too much away, it is the majority of people just downloading random things online, mostly like cracked software. I saw somebody trying to download a gift card, which, you don't download gift cards. At least I've never downloaded a gift card.
Hey, Eric, here's a gift card. Download it. Really?
Download it and make sure to disable your antivirus, because for some reason the gift card regularly triggers antivirus. So you got to disable it first before you can use your gift card.
Unbelievable what people fall for.
No, one of the areas I think is really interesting in tracking InfoStealer campaigns is actually like running some type of OCR on the screenshots, or even using kind of like an LLM application over the screenshots to figure out like what the infection vectors are, and then building a list of like bad IPs and domains based on that. Like there was one recently that I was seeing a lot of people get infected on, where it was like, I'm not going to give the exact domain, but it involved like AI and Midjourney specifically. And for those who aren't aware, Midjourney is like an AI image generation application. And so basically somebody had set up a phishing website, or I get like a fake website for Midjourney. And they then had like they were then offering Midjourney for free to people who downloaded the application. And for those who aren't aware, you don't download Midjourney. And it literally said it, like, I wish I'd included this in the presentation. It literally said under it, like, hey, you may have to disable your antivirus to run this. And then I found 3 other screenshots, one of which said, was somebody Googling AI Midjourney, virus or real? So I guess he'd already downloaded it and then decided to Google to see if it was malware or not, which it was. And then another one where somebody was actually disabling their antivirus after downloading it. So the moral of the story is, number 1, you don't download Midjourney or gift cards. And number 2, if something's telling you to disable your antivirus, it's probably bad. So I don't know if there's any more points you'd like to make on this this slide, Nick.
I think you covered it really well. It's look, this is classic social engineering techniques adopted to a modern world of InfoStealer malware. Look, you have to be running a durable endpoint security, preventative and post-execution product. That's a must-have. But not all companies are there, and not all companies are maybe dialed into the realities of this. And I think it can be very consequential, as Eric highlighted. I do want to answer one of the questions from Barry Malone here in the chat. So Barry was asking, how do you think the wider adoption of passkeys over traditional auth mechanisms will impact the Stealer space? I sort of answered it previously with the DBSC examples. I posted a couple links for you folks to read. But I think broadly, a passkey just can't be stolen the same way and replayed on a bad actor's machine. Because you have to unseal the passkey using usually a biometric. So just for everybody's benefit, passkey allows you to have a private key representation of your authentication materials in a way that's not a password, right? And typically you unseal it using something like a Touch ID in the context of Mac, or Face ID in the context of iOS devices. And so that second factor needs to be provided to use the passkey. Typically, sometimes it can even be a PIN, but that's a factor that's harder to steal and replay. So I think passkeys are absolutely one of the techniques, in addition to DBSC and other cookie-related kind of rotation mechanisms to start to hedge this problem. Thanks for the question, Barry.
Yeah, and for those who aren't aware, although they probably gave it away, you can put your questions in chat if you have any questions for Nick and I, although mostly Nick, because he's going to probably give you better answers than I will. The next thing we want to talk about a little bit, we've touched on this at various points in the presentation, Nick, is this kind of commodification of the cybercrime ecosystem. And I bet you're going to have a very interesting perspective on this, but I'd love to talk about the intersection of kind of ransomware and the gray web and InfoStealer malware as well. Because I do think it's a super interesting place. So like most ransomware groups today, Telegram, fun fact, ransomware groups are one of the few things that Telegram will ban. They will not ban like channels that are like giving out credit card numbers, or channels that are just like dumping InfoStealer logs, or even channels that are like live leveraging Telegram's API to act as a backend for InfoStealer, but they will ban ransomware groups. And do not ask me why. I think it might have had something to do after the Colonial Pipeline breach, where the U.S. like really cracked down on ransomware, and maybe Telegram's like, we don't want to get SEAL Team 6 in Dubai. That's just like my wild guess.
Yes.
But there is actually one dark web forum. Even a lot of the major cybercrime forums stopped hosting ransomware, like XSS and Exploit don't have ransomware as a service recruitment sections anymore. So the only one that they really go to is RAMP, which stands for the Russian Anonymous Marketplace, which still does allow ransomware discussions. But all of that is to provide a lot of context. How do you see ransomware groups and the InfoStealer and the gray ecosystem and the gray web kind of interacting, Nick? I don't know if you have any specific thoughts here.
Yeah. Well, typically, in order to install ransomware, you either need the actor to take an action to download something, or you need credentials of theirs to do it on their behalf. Think of it this way. So classically, the way this happens is IT administrators and system administrators are targeted with phishing emails and or other payloads. These folks tend to have broad access to information systems. Imagine they're a VMware administrator or even a GCP cloud administrator. They have this permissive access like as part of their job, and they probably have long-lived session credentials, because again, it's really hard to have short-lived session credentials in a way that doesn't slow down the business. So how do we get ransomware in those systems to then send the 15 million requests to Caesars Group or MGM? Well, you need to get it on there somehow, right? So either you get it on there through the classic ransomware payload mechanism, or you could do it via InfoStealer to get their credentials and then do it on their behalf, do it for them, basically, facilitate the process, right? And then the rest unfolds in terms of the ransomware request. I think these are intrinsically related. I think ransomware as a service groups and RAMP and some of the others have gotten more airtime and airplay because they've been big news, right? There's been large organizations impacted by this, and I think sort of the broader society understands this better. InfoStealer is still a little bit under the radar. I also think because of the ransomware demands have been large and significant and kind of bold, $30 million, $15 million. I haven't quite seen that happen with InfoStealer, so I think that's why ransomware has gotten more airplay. But they're intrinsically related, and I don't know the reason Telegram bans these, but it's a game of whack-a-mole. Unless you have a very principled way of hedging abuse on platform, and I used to work in this space at Snap, so I have a bunch of experience with this. It's basically impossible to go chase them on a whack-a-mole kind of basis. They're just going to pop up again, and you really need a very programmatic and principled way to enforce it, and you need to care a lot. And I don't think Telegram does, given their nature.
Yeah, no, I think those are fantastic points. And I am going to ask you kind of an out of left field question, Nick, which is where do you think the ransomware ecosystem is going? Because I've seen people, and I won't name them, but I disagree with this personally, but they, some people are saying ransomware is going to end. Other people are saying ransomware is going to continue to explode in profitability and popularity among threat actors. I don't know if you have a specific take on the ecosystem.
I don't think there's an end in sight. Why would it end? There's so much money to be made, and it's actually quite easy. There's a lot of soft, low-hanging fruit kind of targets out there, right? A lot of companies just don't have their things together, and that's just the reality of our industry. Is some of it might be economy driven, with sort of the downturn in tech. Some of it might be driven just the understanding of the space is really complicated. I don't think it's going to end. I don't think government can even regulate it to end. I really think the only way to manage this is to protect your company with very strong EDR capabilities and very strong capabilities on session duration and just-in-time access, really removing overprivileged super admin type accounts. You got to reduce the blast radius, right? I don't see this going away. Nothing indicates it's going away. If anything, it's becoming easier and more commoditized with these as a service kits.
Yeah, it's really interesting too. I think one of the other key drivers that I don't see get talked a lot about in cybersecurity, but it is a different discipline, is geopolitics. My view is kind of 15 years ago, or maybe 12 years ago would have been a better example. So back in 2012, 2013, Russia didn't have the greatest relationship with the United States and Western Europe, but it wasn't like it is now. And so I do think there's this element where, in a lot of respects, Russia very much allows cybercrime against Western Europe and the United States, where, maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago, you would have been at risk of getting arrested. There's not that much risk anymore. And as long as you're not targeting Organizations in the Coalition of Independent States, or CIS, which is kind of
Yeah.
Russia and its like allied neighbor states. And I do think that's probably a significant driver as well, right? If you can operate in a country where you can make way above the median income with very little fear of any retribution, it's really hard for Western law enforcement to crack down on that in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I want to say something kind of bold. Like, I think if Pavel and Putin hadn't gotten into a little bit of a tear, Telegram would probably be able to operate with more immunity and more protections by the Russian Federation if they stayed within Russia. Because especially with what's happening now in the last 2 years with the war in Ukraine, right? And it turns out that the Russian military uses Telegram as the primary communication mechanism. There's been a bunch of analysis done on this. And now, because Pavel and Putin are sort of in a tear and they're not friends, that's a huge risk from a threat intelligence, like military intelligence perspective. And I don't have any like empirical evidence, but I'm pretty sure that the likes of Palantir and British intelligence and U.S. intelligence are using that to give Ukraine a leg up in the war.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other interesting things is I remember reading a headline a few days ago that Russia was requesting, or Russia was trying to help Pavel in custody, and there very much might be a self-interested motive for the Russian Federation to help him escape justice in France. All right, so now we have the real meat of the presentation, Nick. So all of those other slides were just context setting for the really important piece here. So I've got a bunch of questions for you here. To start with, because I think it's probably worth framing this around low, medium, and high resource companies, right? Because there's companies like high-end companies in the tech sector that invest huge amounts and have very large teams in security, like Snapchat. But there's also a lot of companies where maybe there's a security team of 3 people. And I think the way you have to think about problems like we've been discussing and then respond to those problems is very different based on your kind of resource allocation and the type of company you are. And so I'm actually going to start with a really hard question, which is, let's imagine you're the CISO or the security lead at a small retail company, maybe 2,000 employees, or a small community bank, as an example. And you've got a security budget of a few million a year. It's not super significant. You have a couple of resources. What are the best practices, or how would you go about solving this problem? Assume you're walking into almost zero.
Yeah. So I'm going to start with preventative, and I'm going to move to detective, because that's how I think people should think about this. Although you can think about it the other way around too, but I do think this is the better way. Look, bottom line is, info stealer malware runs on a machine if it's allowed to run. If it's not allowed to run, if you have very high quality preventative pre-execution and post-execution controls, which are commonly available, right? Our CrowdStrike friends, created incidents in terms of availability, but they're still pretty damn good at what they do, right? And there's other companies that are pretty good in this space too. So I think you need to have a strong endpoint detection response capability, and that can be purely bought. You don't need to have a large team for that. And sure, configuring it is some time, but if I had a 3-person team, I would definitely have that. Secondly, I would really focus in on highly permissioned, highly consequential accounts and try to get control of those accounts. Whether you're a more traditional company and you have Active Directory, or you're a more modern company, maybe you have Okta or other IDPs, I would really try to get your hands around where are those privileged accounts and how can you reduce the standing access, and how can you do just-in-time provisioning. There's a bunch of providers that can help you with this in the industry, so I'm not going to start naming them, but I would focus in on that. And that's also not terribly hard, but it can be hard depending on the amount of technical debt you have. So those are all preventative if you think about it, right? So again, it's hard on the endpoints. It's a look at the account, look at the permissive accounts, and try to reduce standing permissions. And then thirdly, what I would have is I would have a capability to ingest high fidelity information from platforms like Flare to act on the existence and posting of info stealer information logs about my company, about my community bank, or about my retail entity on the dark and gray web, right? I would probably ingest that into my SOC flows. I would have a SOC analyst or two who can prioritize remediation and action on those posts. And there will be some false positives. This is not a silver bullet. In this space, we are taking the information that's made available to us by bad actors. We're parsing it and packaging it and giving it to you. And I think with some of the innovations that Flare has come up with, even this SOC analyst job of studying the context, can be done with Gen AI. And maybe we can talk a little bit more about that. But those would be the three things I would focus on if I had a small team.
Now, let me ask you another question. This is actually a real question somebody asked me in a presentation. It took me aback, but it's also, I'm coming from the vendor side. So I was like, that actually is probably a good question. So we were doing a presentation on something very similar to community banks at an FSI SAC event. And a small community bank director of information security raises his hand and he asks, how do I, a lot of these info-stealer malware infections happen from employees logging into corporate services from their home computers. And we had in the recommendations, set a policy that employees cannot log into corporate services from their home computers. And he goes he raises his hand, is like, how do I do this? And we're like, well, set a policy. And he's like, yeah, but I'll set a policy and then nobody will follow it. So I don't actually think I gave him a very satisfactory answer,
Yeah.
Nick. How would you go about combating this problem? I thought about it I'm like, that's a good question. That is a hard problem, actually.
No, it is. And and I actually thought about this when I was answering your question, Eric. By the way, all this is unscripted. Like we didn't write it.
I didn't even tell Nick what I was going to ask him.
Yeah. This is real talk. So that's a little bit harder, right? And so to do that, you need to have a beyond corp device trust kind of capability to basically only allow authentication from company managed devices. That's how this director of security at the community bank would end up doing this. What you would basically do is you would work with your IDP providers, whether they're internal or external, and you would implement a capability to profile the machine, install a verification bit on that machine, whether that's like a nonce, like sort of like a cookie, or something like an Okta Verify, which is a thick client application that runs locally. And then during the authentication process, your IDP looks for the existence of that thing while the employee is authenticating. And if that thing doesn't exist, you can't authenticate to the corporate service. That's how this works, right? So if the employee goes home and tries to log in from their dirty Windows laptop to, communitybankportal.com, it's not going to work because those verification bits are not going to be on their system. Again, I don't mean to overly simplify. This is not easy to do, and it takes time. But these things can be purchased. You can hire consultants to help implement and operate them. It's not beyond reach, I would say, of most organizations. And this is a very, very effective way of preventing the dirty Windows laptop from accessing community bank resources.
See, I told you guys his answer is going to be way better than my answer of setting a policy. As it turns out, that you do have to enforce people to follow policies.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Nick, now let's kind of flip the script and imagine you're kind of a high sophistication organization. You have a lot of budget. You have a lot of employees. Mm-hmm. What would be the differences, or both conceptually, how would you think about defense in depth differently than from a small organization, and then also practically, what technologies or solutions would you implement to achieve that kind of achieve your concepts?
Right. Okay. So let's catalog the four things I talked about for, let's say, the smaller, maybe medium-sized resource team. So we have the preventative EDR AV on the endpoints, right, and make sure the policies are set correctly to really look and hedge for this type of threat. Actually, I think that's sort of been mostly solved for now in the industry. So that's the first thing I talked about. Let's say the second thing is the device trust, zero trust beyond corp kind of model. Again, there's ways to do this. Then the third thing is the ingestion the third thing is the right sizing of sensitive permissions to administrative accounts. I would still do that. The fourth thing is the ingestion of threat intelligence data into my SOC and prioritizing some actions. Let's call those the table stakes, right? Now, if I have more resourcing in a larger team, what I would do is I would get more precise. I would start studying the threat intelligence that's coming up in the industry more proactively, rather than waiting for Flare to alert me and tell me, Nick, there was a mention of communitybank.com here, and then a SOC analyst investigate this. I'd actually fund a threat intelligence team to go after and do proactive investigations on emerging threat actor groups, right? To go investigate what they're doing, and that's something we do here, right? What else I would do is I would further try to reduce the blast radius and ability of that info stealer to even execute or be usable, right? So let's say the preventative controls prevent it from running, but maybe in some cases they're not as effective, right? And it can still run, it can still obtain. I would really focus in on tightening my IDP controls to have shorter sessions, and more focused on device trust, which we kind of talked about in the previous example, on where can you authenticate from, right? Because if you can like zoom in on this from both aspects of make it hard for the session to be useful if it's stolen, because it simply expires by the time they get it. Like, okay, so they got it, so what? But it's expired, right? I would focus in on that. And then in addition to, I'd focus on the proactive threat intelligence and also like look at the sort of the corpus of systems that an employee may have access to and try to do more sort of just in time access provisioning where the long lived privileged access is not held forever, which is commonly the case in most companies.
Yeah, I think those are all really excellent recommendations, both limiting the scope of the risk to devices and then also limiting the scope if a device is compromised of how far. I think your term blast radius is a really good one for describing, you know, minimizing the damage and a successful even infostealer infection can do. I think session cookies are also way underrated. You know, when I first began describing this problem to people, I'd often hear like, oh, well, I have two-factor authentication. It's okay. Well, first of all, if they have your username and password, you only have single-factor authentication, even if you previously had two-factor authentication. Because, you know, if they could get through your first factor for free, you really only have one-factor authentication still. And if you have really long session cookies, you're in deep trouble, because then both of your methods of authentication have been bypassed. I think another one that I'd recommend to people would be, and this is very minor and ancillary to Nick's points, would be authenticator applications for two-factor authentication instead of SMS. Because there's obviously SIM swapping, which can be very detrimental to two-factor authentication.
Yeah. Even that, Eric, has been proven to be phishable with phishing fatigue. So the folks who targeted Uber and Electronic Artists, they bypassed the TOTP with basically prompt fatigue. What I would say is if you have a larger resource team, move to YubiKeys, physical keys, or passkeys as a company, completely without exception, right? Like, again, it takes a lot of work. It's not easy to do. This is the guy coming from a big company saying like, go do this, but it can be incremental. You can chip away at the problem. You know, we didn't solve this in a year. It took us some time. So with those level of controls, like this becomes much harder. And even if it were to happen, it's just not probable that they're going to be usable because they won't have the second strong authentication factor.
Yeah, 100%. Nick, do you have any parting words on this slide before we turn it over to see if we have any audience questions? And I would encourage any of our audience members, if you have questions for Nick, please put them in the chat.
Yeah. Man, I think we talked about this quite a bit already, but this is a real legitimate problem that's, you know, highly effective. And well, we've spent 20+ years talking about malware. Like, this version of malware is a lot nastier than anything else I've seen in my 17 years of focusing on cybersecurity. So I pay attention to it. It is as dangerous or close to as dangerous as ransomware. And I think you need to have a multi-layer strategy, as we talked about, in order to both prevent and detect the ability of this impacting your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, let's see if we have any comments or questions. So I see some people talked about our ransomware discussion already. The only way it will end if the US actually goes and grabs these guys from the countries they commit the attack from. I don't know if that's a great idea from Russia. We might be in, we might cause a whole geopolitical incident if SEAL Team 6 is running around Russia. Yeah. Nabbing ransomware threat groups. Although, you know, like one interesting thing I think, Nick, that is a good point is like when the US does figure out who's behind a ransomware group and indicts them, it does prevent them from traveling, right? Like if they indict the leader of a RAS organization or even an affiliate of a RAS organization, they can't necessarily, you know, maybe they were enjoying luxury hotels in Italy with all of their ill-begotten ransomware gains, and suddenly Italy, you know, becomes off limits for travel, or they'll end up arrested. So there is, you know, there is at least some justice in the world, although not complete.
I mean, look through industry policing organizations and like things like Interpol. These guys are getting caught and getting arrested. Like here's one article. So Scattered Spider was one of the prolific threat actors 2022 that was targeting organizations with the fake phishing domains. The guy behind this was arrested in Mallorca on vacation. And for everybody, Mallorca is like a luxury island in the, you know, Spanish Riviera where, you know, the well-to-do go, right? So clearly he had profited off of this and enjoying his life, but he got nabbed as he tried to exit the airport.
Yeah, no, it is. It does create issues for them when they get indicted. So that is a plus point. One final question I had for you, Nick, and then we can probably go ahead and wrap up. And for the folks who are joining us, before I forget to mention this, it is a 3-part series. So Nick is kind enough to be joining us for 2 more of these, where we'll be discussing different aspects of security. I want to talk a little bit about this proactive threat intel team concept, Nick, because I think that threat intel has a reputation in the industry for being low value, low ROI, unnecessary. And I'm curious on like how you would if you were to set up a new team, how you would scope it in a way that you feel that it would create value for the organization on kind of a continuous basis.
Yeah. Well, what you said isn't not true, right? There is a perception that threat intel teams provide intelligence that may not be actionable. There's also perceptions that threat intel teams are purely like cost centers. But I think a lot can be said also about security teams. We're both in a risk-based kind of a part of the market where what we do is prevent the unknowns, right? Prevent the things that we don't really want to happen. So the way I would set it up would be this. I would either lean on a high-quality vendor provider to help me with threat intelligence, even to help me parse some of the threat intelligence. There's products that obviously do this. Flare is one of them. But with the advancements with AI and LLMs, some of the threat intelligence profiling, like report writing, what we call complete threat intelligence or finished threat intelligence, that an analyst used to sit and write a thorough report. A lot of this can actually be automated with products today that can give you this type of intelligence, sort of in a complete form, right? So I would lean into that. If I have a little bit more resourcing and I can hire a couple of people to focus in on this, which would be my preference, of course, I would really have them study the market and what's happening, really have like an ear and a pulse to it, and do investigations on things that have been consequential to other companies in sort of the same cohort of companies that, let's say, our company operates in, and then surface these as investigations, and then surface them to the hardening teams, which is very important to have a discussion, because the threat intelligence only is as useful as how it's presented and what action is taken on it. If no action is taken, then it's not really that useful. It's purely an academic exercise. And there's really 2 ways it can be action. It can be action through new hardening controls to prevent the vector that the bad actors are exploiting or intended to exploit, or with new defensive controls, observability controls, like new signals to just signal on that. So if you can't build a preventative control, you can build a detective control. That's how I would set up the teams, and then they would be basically like serving these other parts of the security organization with awareness, because these other parts of the security organization are often not paying attention to threat intelligence discreetly. If they are, it's not like in a highly facilitated way, and so because of that, it's not as actionable. And so to make it actionable, you have to make it kind of real to the company, and also real to the context in which the company can take an action on it, both from a preventative and a detective perspective.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. I think one of the key points you touched on there that's really worth really highlighting is the kind of right sizing the information to the right team. If you're talking to a CEO, that's a very different conversation than even a board is very different than a CEO, which is very different than a director of information security. And I think a lot of times really technical people have difficulty like translating security data into business, right? There's this disconnect. And so that's a really, really important skill to develop, is like not just thinking, how does this impact our security, right? If you go tell a director of information security, like, oh, there's this new attack that's going to impact our authentication protocols and could have these risks, like they're going to get it. Tell a CEO that, they're like, okay, but what does this mean? Like, where does this impact the company? Like, what do I need to do about it? And that's a very different discussion.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
All right. Well, I think we're going to wrap things up. We're at the top of the hour. Thank you all for joining us today. We will be having 2 more of these webinars. Thank you, Nick, for, as you mentioned, my entirely unscripted interview, where you were kind enough to come on and let me ask you all sorts of questions, many of which I was curious about myself. So it was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, Eric. And thanks everybody for joining us on this Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. Where do you keep recordings? We actually have a YouTube channel, Peter, where we upload recordings of these. So please, Phil, if you go to, let me actually pull it up really quickly before we end. We have a lot. We do a lot of virtual events, and so you are more than welcome to watch previous ones, and you can also expect this one to be up in the next day or 2.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. We'll look forward to the next two.
Awesome. Thank you. Eunice, if you can go ahead and end our presentation for us.